A blind sculptor created something that made the entire art world stop. A sculpture so perfect that critics couldn't explain it. The problem? He had never sculpted a human face in his life, and he had never believed in God, a miracle of the Virgin Mary that even he cannot understand. But before we continue, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I'd love to see how far the miracles of the Virgin Mary are reaching. You know, that kind of artist everyone admires, but few truly understand? Samuel Grant was that kind of artist. 46 years old, blind from birth. He had never seen a face, a color, a sunset, and yet he was one of the most respected sculptors in Chicago. His hands knew the world in a way that eyes never could. When he touched something, it wasn't just texture. It was history, weight, temperature, intention. In his small studio, Samuel created abstract sculptures that galleries fought over, shapes that made sense without needing eyes to see them, curves that spoke directly to something deeper. How do you know when it's finished? Journalists would ask. When the hands stop searching, he always replied. But there was something about Samuel that few people knew. He lived alone, completely alone. No family, few friends, no one truly close. The studio was his sanctuary. The clay, his only real companion. And he had made peace with that, or so he thought. Samuel was also an atheist. Not out of rebellion, not out of anger. At least that's what he told himself. He simply never believed. How can you believe in something you've never seen? How can you have faith in something you cannot touch, feel, or prove? Science was his religion. Abstract forms were his prayers. And it worked for him. It had worked for decades. Until that March of 2024. The problem began quietly, the way the worst crises always do. Sales started to drop. Not suddenly, but gradually. One bad month, then another, then another. The abstract art market is oversaturated, the gallery owners said. People want something different now. Samuel tried not to worry. He had savings. He had a reputation. Things would get better. But they didn't. The gallery that had represented his work for 8 years called to cancel the spring exhibition. "It's not about quality, Samuel," said Richard Morrison, his voice heavy with that pity Samuel despised. "It's the market. People just aren't buying abstract art the way they used to." Samuel hung up the phone and sat in the silence of the studio for a long time. The rent was 3 months overdue. The landlord had been patient. Samuel was a long-time tenant, but patience had its limits. On the workbench sat the last block of high-quality clay he had bought, expensive, imported from Italy. The kind of material that deserved a special piece. But for what? For whom? The nights had grown longer, the loneliness heavier. Samuel spent hours in the empty studio, his hands idle, without inspiration, without purpose. Have you ever felt like that, as if you were floating alone in an empty space, without direction? Samuel knew that feeling well, and he was beginning to drown in it. The first time it happened, Samuel thought it was just an ordinary dream. It was a Tuesday in March. He had finally managed to fall asleep after hours of lying awake, worried about bills, the future, and the emptiness that seemed to be expanding around him. In the dream there was a presence. Samuel couldn't see in the traditional sense, but something was different, a feeling that someone was there, and then a touch. Soft hands touched his face. It wasn't frightening. It was gentle, infinitely gentle, the kind of touch you receive from someone who truly cares. Samuel hadn't felt that kind of touch in years, maybe decades. The hands guided his upward, and then he was touching a face. No, feeling a face. Every curve, every proportion, every detail, the bone structure, the smoothness of the skin, the shape of the nose, the chin. And then a sensation he couldn't name, peace, deep, inexplicable peace. When he woke up, his hands were still tingling. Strange, he murmured to himself, and went on with his day. But the next night it happened again. The same dream, the same presence, the same hands guiding his, the same unforgettable face, and that peace he didn't feel while awake. On the third night, Samuel tried to resist. He drank strong coffee before bed, played music, anything to keep from having that dream again. It didn't work. The presence was there, stronger this time, and with it a feeling Samuel couldn't ignore. You are not alone. They weren't words. It was something deeper, a certainty settling into his soul. But Samuel was a man of science, of reason. Dreams were just the brain processing information, nothing more. Still, when he woke up on the fourth consecutive morning with his hands tingling, he began to wonder. After a week of identical dreams, Samuel made a decision that made no sense at all. It was 3 a.m. He had just awakened from the same dream for the 7th time. But this time, something was different. The sense of loneliness that had consumed him for months had lessened, as if the presence from the dream had stayed with him, even after he woke. Samuel got out of bed, walked to the studio, his footsteps echoing through the empty apartment. He went straight to the workbench. His hands found the last block of Italian clay. Expensive, precious. "This is madness," he said aloud to the empty studio, and yet he began to prepare the clay. He wet his hands, felt the cold, damp texture between his fingers, and closed his eyes, a meaningless habit for a blind man, yet one that helped him focus. Then he let his hands search. Normally, when he sculpted, there was a plan, an idea, an abstract form he wanted to explore. But now he was simply following a sensory memory from a dream, following something he couldn't explain. The first night, he worked for 3 hours. When he stopped, exhausted, a basic shape had emerged, a head, a face beginning to take form. For 3 weeks, Samuel worked on the sculpture, but here was the strange thing. Samuel had never sculpted a human face before. He had tried, of course, but always failed. How could he capture expression, emotion, humanity in something he only knew through brief touches and other people's descriptions? Except now his hands knew. Whenever he tried to consciously control the process, to analyze what he was doing, to make logical decisions, he lost the way. The form became lifeless, directionless. But when he surrendered, when he let his hands follow the sensory memory of that impossible dream, when he stopped thinking and simply felt perfection, it was terrifying and wonderful at the same time. The proportions were right without him knowing why. The expression was serene without him having planned it. Every detail flowed naturally from his hands as if it had always been there, waiting to be revealed. Samuel worked in absolute silence. No music, no distractions, only him, the clay, and that presence that now seemed always there, even when he was awake. The loneliness that had consumed him for months had vanished completely. He didn't understand how. He didn't understand why. But for the first time in years, Samuel didn't feel alone, and that frightened him almost as much as it fascinated him. It was a Friday night when Samuel made the final touch. The studio was utterly silent. Only the sound of his breathing and the faint noise of his hands shaping the clay. He had spent the last 6 hours refining the final details, the folds of the mantle, covering the sculpture's head, the subtle texture that suggested hair beneath it, the last adjustments to the expression. And then it was done. Samuel knew when it was done. His hands stopped adjusting. They simply stopped. He took a deep breath, exhausted. Trembling slightly, he didn't know it from physical fatigue or something deeper. His hands, still damp from the work, rested on the table beside the sculpture. "It's finished," he whispered. And then he did something he hadn't done through the entire process. He ran his hands over the completed sculpture from start to finish, with no intention to alter, only to feel. He began at the top, the head covered by a mantle. His hands moved downward, following the form, the face. The smooth forehead, the delicately suggested eyebrows. The eyes closed in an expression of absolute peace. The nose perfectly proportioned, the lips bearing the faintest hint of a smile, not of joy, but of compassion. Samuel's hands moved down over the shoulders, then over the mantle, the folds of the ceramic, the way it fell over the shoulders, the pattern of the creases, and something clicked. A memory exploded in his mind with such force it made him stagger. Small hands. His own hands, but as a child's, 5, maybe 6 years old. Another hand, larger, warm, gentle, guiding his over something cold, a voice he hadn't heard in 40 years. "Do you feel it, Samuel? This is the face of the Virgin Mary. She will always take care of you, my love. Always." His mother. The memory was so vivid, so real, that Samuel gasped. She used to do that, before bedtime. She would place a small image of the Virgin Mary in his hands, let him explore it with his fingers. And she would say those words, "She will always take care of you." Samuel had buried that memory decades ago. After his mother passed, he was 12 then, he rejected everything connected to that image, to that promise. If she takes care of everyone, why did she take his mother? He had thrown that image away, rejected faith, rejected everything. And now, Samuel's hands trembled over the sculpture, the proportion of the face, the curve of the cheeks, the shape of the veil. It was identical to the small image his mother used to place in his hands. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking. "No, it can't be." But hands don't lie. Hands remember. He had buried that memory, had sworn never to think of that image again. And his own hands had recreated it, perfectly, without knowing. Samuel felt his legs weaken. "How?" he whispered. "How is this possible?" And then it happened. The scent of roses, faint at first, then stronger, filling the entire studio. Impossible. There were no flowers there. There never had been. Samuel had no plants, nothing with any fragrance, but the scent was undeniable, real, intense, fresh roses, as if someone had just brought a huge bouquet into the studio. The fragrance grew stronger, and with it that feeling from the dream, that presence. But now Samuel knew who it was. "It was you," he whispered, voice trembling. "In the dreams. It was always you." His legs gave out. Samuel fell to his knees on the cold studio floor. Years of certainty collapsed in seconds. Years of anger toward a promise he thought had been broken. Years of loneliness he had chosen. Everything crumbled. Samuel began to cry, not silent tears, deep primitive sobs that came from a place he had locked away for decades. "My mother was right," he sobbed. "You always took care of me, even when I rejected you, even when I blamed you." The scent of roses lingered, surrounding him like an embrace. "Forgive me," Samuel wept. "Forgive me for blaming you. Forgive me for being so alone when you were always there." His hands pressed against the cold floor, his body shook with sobs. And then something else happened. Samuel blinked. Something was different. He blinked again. The total darkness he had known since birth was no longer total. There was light, not images, not defined shapes, but light. Samuel raised his trembling hands before his face, and he saw figures, shadows. The faint outlines of his own fingers against the light. "My God," he whispered. And for the first time in 46 years, "My God" was not an empty expression. It was prayer. It was acknowledgement. It was surrender. Samuel slowly turned toward the workbench, toward the sculpture. He couldn't see details, but he saw the form, the silhouette, its presence there. The scent of roses began to fade slowly, But the vision remained, blurred, partial, yet real. And that peace, the peace from his dreams, it was now within him, part of him. Samuel stayed on his knees on the cold studio floor for a long time. He didn't know how long. It didn't matter. When he finally managed to stand, trembling, he leaned on the workbench beside the sculpture. He ran his hands over it once more, reverently now. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for waiting." The last trace of the rose fragrance drifted away. But Samuel knew. He knew something had changed forever, not just in his eyes, in his soul. On Monday morning, Richard Morrison, the owner of the gallery who had canceled Samuel's exhibition months earlier, visited the studio. He came only to return some old pieces that had been in storage. Nothing important. But when he entered the studio, he stopped. At the center of the main workbench, illuminated by the natural light streaming through the window, stood the sculpture of the Virgin Mary. Richard was utterly silent for 5 minutes. Samuel, who could now see shapes, remained quiet. He let the piece speak for itself. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice strange. "Samuel, what is this?" "A sculpture," Samuel replied simply. "I know it's a sculpture. But how? You never made figures, never made portraits, and this—" Richard stepped closer. "The proportions are perfect. The expression, there's something in it I can't explain. It's not just technical skill, it's presence." Samuel said nothing. Richard walked around the piece, studying it from every angle. "This is the Virgin Mary," he said, not as a question, but as recognition. "Yes. How did you study sacred art, Byzantine icons?" "No." "Then how did you manage to capture this?" Samuel thought about how to answer, how to explain the inexplicable. "She showed me," he finally said. Richard looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Samuel, I need to exhibit this. Immediately. This week, if possible." "You can exhibit it," Samuel replied, "but she's not for sale." "What? Samuel, you could make—" "She's not for sale," Samuel repeated firmly. "She never will be. You can exhibit her, but she stays with me." Richard looked as if he wanted to argue, but something in Samuel's expression stopped him. "All right. Exhibition only, then." The exhibition took place 3 days later. Richard placed the sculpture alone in a separate room. Simple lighting, no distractions. Just her. The response was unexpected. Art critics, who normally devoured works with technical analyses, fell silent before the piece. They simply observed, some for minutes, others for half an hour or more. People who entered chatting and laughing stopped. The room grew quiet in her presence. One critic wrote, "The proportions are technically perfect, corresponding to classical Marian icons, but it isn't the technique that captures you. It's something intangible, presence, peace, compassion that transcends the material." Another wrote, "In 30 years analyzing art, I've never seen a piece affect observers in this way. It's not just beautiful, it's transformative." The offers began. $10,000, $20,000, $50,000, $80,000. Samuel refused them all. "She's not for sale." But something else happened because of the exhibition. The commissions began. A church wanted an image of St. Francis. A family wanted an image of Jesus Christ. Another parish needed new Stations of the Cross. Everyone wanted Samuel Grant to create for them. The studio phone rang constantly. Richard was thrilled. "Samuel, you found your market. Sacred art, it's perfect." But Samuel knew it wasn't about the market. It wasn't about money. It was about purpose. For the first time in 46 years, his art had a purpose beyond personal expression. It had meaning beyond abstract form. Every piece he created now would be a prayer, a testimony, a way to share what he had found in that cold studio on a March night. Samuel began accepting commissions, but selectively, only the ones he felt he should do. He couldn't explain it better than that. He just knew. And his vision kept improving, slowly, gradually, over the course of weeks. It never became perfect. Samuel would never see the world as people with normal sight did, but he could see shapes, silhouettes, light and shadow. He could see enough to move around without a cane. The doctors couldn't explain it. People born blind don't develop sight at 46, they said. Neurologically impossible. This shouldn't be happening. But it was. Samuel didn't try to convince them, didn't try to prove anything. He simply accepted it. His financial life stabilized completely. The studio was secure, the bills were paid. There was enough money not only to survive, but to live comfortably. But Samuel discovered that mattered less than he had thought. What mattered was waking up in the morning without that emptiness in his chest, working in the studio knowing he wasn't alone, creating art that meant something beyond shape and texture. For the first time in decades, he had peace, 6 months after that March night. Samuel's studio looked different now, still simple, still functional, but no longer empty. On the shelves stood several sculptures in different stages of completion, each one created with the same care, the same purpose, the same sense of connection. But at the center of the studio, on a special pedestal, remained the original, the Virgin Mary that had changed everything. Samuel never sold it, never made a replica. That one was unique, special, untouchable. Every night before closing the studio, he would stop before her. With his limited vision, he saw her shape, the silhouette his hands knew so well, the presence that had never again allowed him to feel alone. "Thank you," he whispered, as he had done every night for the past 6 months. "Thank you, Virgin Mary, for showing me." He ran his hands gently over the sculpture, from the top of her head, down her face, over her mantle. "My mother was right," Samuel whispered. "I was just too blind to see." Then he smiled at the irony. Too blind to see, literally and figuratively. "But now I see," he said softly. Samuel turned off the lights, and as he left, he looked back one last time. At the silhouette of the Virgin Mary, at the miracle his own hands had created without knowing it, at the living proof that sometimes when we are most lost, when loneliness feels unbearable, when we give up on everything, sometimes that's exactly when we are found and never left alone again. I want to honor all of you who take the time to comment, share your faith, and help build this community. In the next video, the first 20 people will have their names featured as a special thank you. It's my way of giving back the love I receive from you. And look, if you made it this far, all the way to the end of Samuel's story, do one thing for me. Write in the comments roses, the perfume that changed everything. I want to see how many hearts this story has truly touched. And every time I read roses in the comments, I'll know that one more person believes that the miracles of the Virgin Mary still happen. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to renew their hope today. May the Virgin Mary continue to bless and protect you and your family. Amen.